lost my own set of wheels and been stripped away. These ones are smaller, so here I must stay. My life is in this chair now, passing each day, making these steps harder to take.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate some of you might want to take my photograph. One of the two of you might want to take Professor Hawkins. Can I please ask that you do not use flash photography? That is really, really important. Headway Suffolk are producing photographs. If you want to purchase a photograph off of us, go towards the house. You can do so next week, but please do not use flash photography. Driving to work on the first day in January 2016, like lots of people, I thought, what's 2016 going to have in store for us at Headway Suffolk and for me personally? In previous years, our chairman, Alistair Renton, and myself had had the honour of representing Headway Suffolk at Buckingham Palace Garden Party. I had previously been to number 10 Downing Street and met with the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, and John Major, to talk about brainy dogs, Headway Suffolk, and brain injury. We had welcomed the Countess of Wessex, who had come to Headway Suffolk, spent the afternoon with us, and watched our version of Wizard of Oz. So, what would 2016 bring? I didn't have to wait long, because on the mat was a letter the postman had already been, and that had the logo of Cambridge University. And I thought, I know who that's from. And I opened it, and I thought it said, "Dear Helen, thank you for the invitation of Professor Hawking coming to your conference, but he's far too busy, and your conference is far too small." And then my neurons said, read that again. I read it again, and it actually said, Professor Hawking would be delighted to be here today. And of course, anything that Professor Hawking does is not silly, and is not small, but it's huge. I then spent the rest of the year thinking, how do I introduce the most intelligent man that's ever been on our planet? And I've decided just to say, Professor Hawking, we're really honoured to have you here today. I know you've been poorly, and I know you put great effort into coming here today, but we really do welcome you, and we appreciate you coming, and I'll ask you to join me on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome.
Can you hear me? I would like to thank Headway Suffolk and Mrs. Helen Fairweather for inviting me here today to talk about my journey with MND. As some of you may have seen from the film, in which Eddie Redmayne plays a particularly handsome version of me, in my third year at Oxford, I noticed that I seemed to be getting clumsier. I fell over once or twice, and couldn't understand why. I was somewhat disgruntled to be told by a doctor at the time to lay off the beer, but I suppose that is understandable when talking with a student. A year went by, and I had moved to Cambridge to undertake my PhD, but one Christmas, I went skating on the lake at St. Albans, my hometown, and I fell over again. But this time I couldn't get up, so my mother took me to the family doctor who referred me to hospital for tests. I was just over 21 years of age. It was 1962, and the tests then were somewhat more primitive than they are now. I stayed in for 2 weeks. A muscle sample was taken from my arm, I had electrodes stuck into me, radio-opaque fluid was injected into my spine, and the doctors watched it going up and down on X-rays, as the bed was tilted. After all that, I still wasn't told what I had, and gathered from the doctor's conversations that it, whatever it was, would only get worse, and there was nothing they could do except give me vitamins. I could see that they didn't expect them to have much effect. I didn't want to ask more questions, but I learned, years later, that I had motor neuron disease. The realization that I had an incurable disease was a bit of a shock. I felt it was unfair. How could something like this happen to me? I had no idea what my future would turn out to be, and was advised to return to Cambridge and carry on with my research into general relativity and cosmology. But it was a confusing time, and I discovered Wagner, who seemed to me to be as tragic a figure as I felt at the time. It was also around then that I met Jane, my first wife, and at the same time was awarded a research fellowship at Gonville and Keyes College in Cambridge. Things were looking up. I had a job, and the fellowship meant that Jane and I could marry, which we did in July 1965. The disease progressed rapidly at first. But it then slowed down, and I got through the rest of the 60s and then the 70s, with some increasing disability. But the birth of our 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim, helped enormously with the difficulties of the MND symptoms. I felt lucky. I never imagined that we would be able to have 3 beautiful and accomplished children, and they are the best achievements in my life. If you can call children achievements. It was a few days after the birth of Lucy in 1970 that I had a eureka moment. While getting to bed one evening, I realized that black holes were not really black. They had a temperature and would glow red like hot coals. I had discovered a concept which is named after me, Hawking radiation. This theory took my research down new avenues, but what it also proved was that MND is no barrier to thinking, achieving, and getting on with life. We just have to find new ways of doing things. However, by the early 80s, I continued to get worse, and had prolonged choking fits because my larynx was weakening, and was letting food into my lungs as I ate. And in 1985, I caught pneumonia on a trip to CERN, the European Center for Nuclear Research, in Switzerland. This was a life-altering moment. I was rushed to the Lucerne Cantonal Hospital and put onto a ventilator. The doctor suggested to my wife, Jane, that things had progressed to the stage where nothing could be done, and suggested to her that they turn off my ventilator to end my life. But Jane refused, and had me flown back to Edinburgh by air ambulance. As you may imagine, this was a very difficult time, but thankfully the doctors at Edinburgh tried hard to get me back to how I had been before the visit to Switzerland. However, because my larynx was still allowing food and saliva into my lungs, they had to perform a tracheostomy. But, and as most of you will know, a tracheostomy takes away the ability to speak. For a while, the only way I could communicate was to spell out words, letter by letter, by raising my eyebrows when someone pointed to the right letter on a spelling card. It is pretty difficult to carry on a conversation this way, let alone write a scientific paper. Your voice is very important. If it is slurred, as mine was, people can think you are mentally deficient and treat you accordingly. Before the tracheostomy, my speech was so indistinct that only people who knew me well could understand me. But at least I could communicate. I wrote scientific papers by dictating to a secretary, and I gave seminars through an interpreter, who repeated my words more clearly. Life went on. Luckily, and somewhat surprisingly, a computer expert in California, named Walt Wolters, heard of my difficulties. He sent me a computer program he had written called Equalizer. This allowed me to select whole words from a series of menus on the computer screen on my wheelchair by pressing a switch in my hand. Today I use a program called ACAT, developed by Intel, which I control by a small sensor in my glasses via my cheek movements. When I have typed what I need to say, I then send it to a speech synthesizer, which relays it in the voice which is recognizable as belonging to me. I identify with this voice, and have no intention of changing it for a more naturally sounding one. However, after returning home from the tracheostomy, it took me a bit of time to get back to working with equalizer, voltasis software, but I used it to edit and correct my book, A Brief History of Time, which was published in 1988. This broke all records by being in the Sunday Times bestsellers list for more than 4 years. Thankfully, the Bible and Shakespeare do not count. Indeed, the book was originally meant to be called From the Big Bang to Black Holes, A Short History of Time. The title was shortened and changed to Brief, and the rest is history. It has been imitated many times, most recently as the title for a Radio 3 program about the speaking clock, called A Brief History of Tim. But an imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Undoubtedly, the human interest story of how I have managed to be a theoretical physicist and a best-selling author, despite my disabilities, has helped. When I controlled the program with the hand switch, I could boast that I could talk with my mouth full. Now that I use a cheap switch, I can no longer say this, because chewing activates the switch, and what I would say would be nonsense. But the situation with my larynx was not improving, and I was finding it increasingly difficult to eat and breathe. It was then a second life-altering coincidence occurred. In 1998, my second wife, Elaine, and I were on a flight to Crete to attend a conference. A fellow passenger on that flight was David Howard, an ENT surgeon. He introduced himself as he had been watching me struggle to eat and breathe, and he told us that he could probably solve the problem for me, as he was a surgeon in London specializing in reconstructive throat surgery. We exchanged contact details and I began to consider David's offer. The reason I needed to consider throat surgery was because after the tracheostomy in 1985, I had a plastic tube in my trachea, which prevented food and saliva from getting into my lungs. Over time, the pressure in the cuff, which keeps the plastic tube in place, damaged my trachea and made me increasingly cough and choke. There seemed to be no solution to this problem until I met David on that flight to Greece. Once back in Cambridge, we were also coping with my weight loss. By then I weighed a mere 6 stone, with almost continual chest infections, which were a drain on my general health. The most unpleasant thing for me was that I had to cough up a lot of the food that had slipped into my lungs during each meal. So, after a few more weeks, we decided to invite David to our home so he could explain what his surgery would involve. David admitted that the odds of me surviving the reconstructive throat surgery were slim, but then we also knew that my odds of enjoying life or surviving for much longer were also minimal. I decided to have the operation. I was admitted to the old Victorian Hospital, the Royal National Throat, Nose and Ear Hospital, in Gray's Inn Road, London, on 4th May 1999, less than a year after that coincidental meeting on the flight to Greece. By then my larynx had no useful function remaining. contrary to popular belief, the most important function of the larynx is not voice, which I had already lost. It is the protection of your lungs, by closing off the airway each time you swallow. The tracheostomy that Roger Gray did in Cambridge in 1985 had done a fine job, but years of having the plastic cuff blown up inside my trachea meant that it had almost eroded through into my esophagus. The wall between the two tubes was paper thin, and this was now a life-threatening situation. In addition, I was at that time at risk of another life-terminating condition, bronchopneumonia, especially as my weight was so low with malnutrition. I had no physical reserves. It was clear. The risks of David's laryngectomy surgery were overwhelmingly outweighed by the risks of no surgery. I had the operation and was sent home with Elaine and the team 16 days later. That was 17 years ago.
Sorry, there's a technical issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got some technical problems, but we have already got Professor Hawkins' speech done by video link, so we're going to try and get that relayed to you. But while we're doing that, we're going to make some presentations to Professor Hawkins. Professor Hawking, when I first wrote to you, you sent me a photograph of yourself. I thought you possibly wouldn't want a photograph of me, so instead we put together some photographs of Headway Suffolk, which I'd like to present to you now. At Headway, we try and encourage young people. They're tomorrow's doctors, nurses and carers. We have most of the UEA, University of East Anglia's medical school and nursing school here. I think there's some professors in Norwich wondering where their students are because they're all here. Later on at Kesgrave, hopefully Professor Hawking will meet about 60 people from local high schools who are interested in our work. And very often we take students on work placements. We've had people from University of East Anglia, Suffolk University, Suffolk New College and high schools come to visit us on placements. This summer you'll be pleased to know, Professor Hawking, we had 2 medical students from Cambridge University come and visit us. We've had students from as far as Singapore, and next year we welcome students from USA. All young people are special, and we celebrate them all, and we wish them well in their future careers. However, now and again, we meet somebody extra special. And that happened this year when Bronya Meller came to us on her work experience as a young 15-year-old. Bronya got what I called the Headway Suffolk bug, in that she can't keep away. So she spent her entire summer holiday working at Headway Suffolk and helping the people with neurological conditions. So with that in mind, Bronya's been given the privilege of presenting Professor Hawking with a bouquet of flowers. Bronya. Bronya, just stay there with him. Thank you, Bronya. And it's right that the last presentation should be made by a Headway Suffolk client. Sometimes tragedy happens more than once in a family, and unfortunately Robert lost his wife this year to dementia, and she was a Headway client. But Robert himself has been a Headway client for a long time and is a stroke survivor. He's an artist and produces some fantastic work for us, and it's fitting that another wheelchair user should present Professor Hawkins with some of his artwork. Robert. Thank you. There you go, Professor Hawkins. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Robert. Thank you, Annette. Thank you. Brilliant. I don't know how we're getting on with the rest of the video clip. We're in? Okay, we'll watch that now. Thank you, everybody.
I have since changed my doctor. For the last 3 years, I have been on full-time ventilation, using an IP3 plus ventilator on the back of my wheelchair. But I feel lucky. My disability has not been a serious handicap in my scientific work, and it has not prevented me from leading a full and active life. I believe people with disabilities should concentrate on things that their handicap doesn't prevent them from doing, and not regret those they can't do. Easily said, I know. But it has been a glorious time for me to be alive and doing my research, and I am happy if I have added something to our understanding of the universe. So where next? I will be 75 years old in January, and I still have a full-time job as Director of Research at the Center for Theoretical Cosmology at Cambridge, and I'm soon to publish another scientific paper with 2 colleagues. This is an exciting time to be a theoretical physicist. I know that most of you might find that hard to believe, but remember the recent announcement that Einstein's general theory of relativity has been uniquely proved by the detection of gravitational waves. Or the announcement that soon we will be able to travel to planets in tiny, microchip spacecraft. And then there's Hawking the cosmonaut. In 2007, I was lucky to complete a zero-gravity flight in a specially modified Boeing 727 jet. As the plane underwent a series of 8 plunges, I could float freely for the first time since I was diagnosed with MND, unrestricted by my paralysis or my wheelchair. It was utterly amazing, and I could have gone on and on. I firmly believe that private space ventures are vital to reduce the cost of space tourism, and to make it accessible to the greatest number of people. I will go further. I don't think the human race has a future if it doesn't go into space. My plan is now to travel in Richard Branson's new Virgin Galactic spaceship, the Virgin Spaceship Unity. I have always dreamed of space flight, and never thought I would have the opportunity to see our beautiful planet from space, or gaze outward into the infinity beyond. Fortunately, Richard Branson heard me say this in a radio interview, and called me to offer me a seat on one of his spaceships. I said yes immediately and have never changed my mind. We are entering a new space age, and it seems we are able to cooperate more between nations in space, in a way that we can only envy on Earth. Pioneering space travel will help us all to recognize our place and our future in the cosmos, which is where I believe our future lies. Space, here I come. Thank you for listening.
Professor Hawkins. We're not going to stop clapping. Professor Hawking, that was brilliant. It's always very difficult to talk about yourself, possibly much easier to talk about black holes and big bangs and things, but we really, really do appreciate it. Thank you ever so much for putting that effort and coming and joining us today at Headway. That speech will be released on Headway Suffolk's YouTube channel later on today and through our website if you want to listen to it again. And we have one that was pre-recorded so it won't have the gaps in. I'm now going to whisk Professor Hawking and the rest of the presenters away, and I'm going to hand over to Jamie, who will explain to you what's happening next. Jamie.
This is me.